What's going on? All thanks for tuning in once again. Let's talk Ajagba versus Bakole. Um, Fight recap. It went exactly how I thought. I mentioned in the breakdown that Ajagba can beat Bakole on points. He can box him. He's a better boxer. Um, my initial prediction was Bakole by KO, but after seeing the weigh-in, I definitely did think if he would be fast enough to catch him. Let's understand that Bakole is a guy that likes to come forward. He can get you at long range as well. That's why I was thinking that he would catch him um, on the back foot, with the right hand, straight right hand. And he did get him to the ropes a couple of times, but he just couldn't catch him earlier in the fight. It took him a while to land some meaningful shots. Ajagba, did exactly what I said, what I expected. Fight behind the jab, throw the right hand, things like that. That's exactly what I mentioned in the breakdown. And he had it in the bag, in my opinion. Ajagba. I don't know why he didn't finish as strong as he could have. He was definitely winning those first rounds. But Bakole forcefully coming forward, like I mentioned, he just couldn't keep up with the Ajagba. He was just a fraction slower than he needed to be. And this is from weight, in my opinion. He needed to be at 270, 280 coming into the fight. He was close to 300, which was a huge factor. He just couldn't keep up with him. Ajagba was on the back foot, and Bakole was overreaching at times, overextending the punches because he couldn't move fast enough. He needed to be at around 280, in my opinion. The fight was a draw. I thought that Ajagba done enough to win, but at the same time, he just didn't. He didn't give enough in the end. He had that fight, like I say, in the bag. He had it in the bag. He was the better boxer of the night. He was landing the right hand, short right. He was timing him well with the jab. But he just couldn't. Push down on the gas at the end. Round 8, 9, 10. Bakole was getting him on the ropes, hurting him at times, landing clean shots. And we know that Bakole doesn't have the biggest gas tank on him, so he had to really dig deep just to, stand a chance. And I'm sure that he would have known, that his corner would have said, hey, listen, you're behind. Like I said, first half of the fight, I had Ajagba winning. Those end rounds, he really needed to win those championship rounds, it's just to get the decision, because Bakole was, in my opinion, the favourite to win. When I say favourite to win, I know that he was the favourite to win on in the casino, but I'm talking about, crowd favourite. I'm talking about the judges want him to win. Turkey and all these people, they want to set him up for fights. Sometimes boxing is like that, where they have fighters that they just want to win. And Bakole just done enough for the draw, I thought that it was more of a, because it was a 10-round fight, I thought it was 6 rounds to 4. And Ajagba's favour. But just those end rounds, he just couldn't. He just slowed down. But going forward, Bakole really needs to be more disciplined with the weight. He really needs to shred it down. He was caught on short notice against Joseph Parker. Did he not have enough time to prepare? No excuses at the end of the day. He shouldn't have really got to 315 to start with. I think he was at 315 at one point, 315 pounds, where he's like a 280 pound fighter. That's where he's comfortable fighting at that weight, because he is forcefully coming forward. He does depend on brute strength and KO ability, to hurt guys, slow them down and win. Like I mentioned, Ajagba was always going to win on points. He was the better boxer. Bakole had to win by knockout. That's how I saw the fight. That's how I predicted the fight. And it came close, it came close to that conclusion. Ajagba almost beat him. In my opinion, like I say, the judges favoured Bakole to win this one, or to draw it, I should say, to come with the draw. So I'm expecting them to run it back, and I'm hoping that this is a big wake-up call for Bakole, because even his trainer was telling Ajagba that he won the fight, which is quite sad to see, when people, trainers or coaches, whatever you want to call them, when they go behind your back and they tell the other fighter, hey, you won that. I remember when the Wilder Fury fight, we had a similar scenario where, I think his name was Debala or something like that. He told Lou Debala, I think that's his name, correct me if I'm wrong, but he told Fury that, hey, you won that fight. It's sad when your team does that too. It's best to keep those comments to themselves, tell you, after the fight, instead of sort of stab you in the back. But I think this is what Bakole needed. He needed this sort of wake-up call, that although he did have a great performance against Anderson, he did, look like he was the boogeyman against Anderson. This is a big wake-up call for him to, drop the weight. You're too slow, you can't keep up. You're looking sloppy in there, you're overextending. You can't move, you can't keep up with the fighters. He's going to struggle against guys like Usyk, majorly, if Usyk's still around. He's going to struggle against movers. He has to be able to close the gap faster, whether it's fractions of seconds. Every second counts with him, and he needs to be at a comfortable weight, so he can land those long shots, which I know that he can land. He can land long shots. He can fight short and long, but he just needs to work on the foot speed. So hopefully this is a big wake-up call. I want to see Bakole fight these top guys. Ajagba, great fight. I'm not taking anything away from him, except that he had the fight in the bag. He had to really push on the gas in those last rounds to really just take it out of the judges' hands, where he's won too many rounds where they can't favour the other guy. But that's how I saw it anyway. I thought that Bakole's foot speed was the game changer. He couldn't close the gap quick enough, and Ajagba was controlling him with the jab and the right hand. Leave your take. Who do you see him fighting next? What did you think of the fight? And I'll catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.